February 12, 1945, 13 hours. Processing area, Camp Clinton, Mississippi. The air is thick, not with the familiar iron and cordite stench of the front, but with a humid, alien warmth that clings to the skin. For Gefreiter Klaus Richter, late of the 2nd Panzer Division, the world has shrunk to the length of this dusty processing line. He is 19 years old. Just weeks ago, his universe was the frozen hell of the Ardennes, a landscape of skeletal trees and the constant gnawing hunger that felt like a living thing inside him. Now he stands under a pale American sun, the coarse fabric of a new U.S. Army issue work shirt scratching at his neck. His own lice-ridden Feldgrau uniform has been taken away, deloused and burned. With it, a part of him has been incinerated too. In the breast pocket of his old tunic, now reduced to ash, had been a photograph, a creased wallet-worn image of his mother and younger sister, standing by the well on their farm in Bavaria. Their faces were his shield against the chaos, a silent promise of a world beyond the war. Now even that is gone. He is a number, a name on a list, a prisoner. The barbed wire stretches in immaculate geometric lines into the distance, a stark cage under an indifferent sky. The guards are not the snarling monsters of Dr. Goebbels' newsreels. They are tall, bored-looking young men who chew gum with a lazy rhythm. They don't shout. They don't strike anyone. Their calm efficiency is more unnerving than brutality would be. Klaus and the other new arrivals, a haggard collection of boys and old men scraped from the bottom of Germany's manpower barrel, are herded towards a long wooden building. A low hum emanates from within, and with it, a smell. It is a smell that stops him in his tracks. It is not the thin, watery aroma of turnip soup or the bitter scent of ersatz coffee that has been his sustenance for a year. This is something else entirely. It is rich, complex, and unbelievably powerful. It is the scent of roasting meat, of baking bread, of something sweet and foreign. It is the smell of a life he has forgotten exists. He feels his stomach, long accustomed to the dull ache of emptiness, clench in a painful, hopeful spasm. He looks at the man next to him, a veteran of Stalingrad with hollow eyes, and sees the same bewildered disbelief. They have been told they are being taken to a place of starvation and slave labor. But that smell promises something else, something utterly, terrifyingly impossible. By early 1945, the vast military machine of the Third Reich was hemorrhaging men. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet steamroller was relentless, grinding entire army groups into dust. In the West, following the catastrophic failure of the Ardennes offensive, the Allied armies under Eisenhower were poised on the banks of the Rhine, preparing the final death blow. The result was a tidal wave of German prisoners, a logistical problem of unprecedented scale for the Western Allies. Between D-Day and VE Day, American forces alone would process over 5 million captured enemy personnel. The question of what to do with them was governed by a document signed 15 years earlier in a time of peace. The 1929 Geneva Convention, relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. It was a pact of reciprocity, a promise of humane treatment intended to safeguard a nation's own captured soldiers. For the United States, adhering to the convention was not merely a matter of honor. It was a strategic imperative. Every positive report from a Red Cross inspector about conditions in an American POW camp was a shield for Allied airmen held in a German Stalag Luft. The crucial passage was Article 11. The POW food ration of prisoners of war shall be equivalent in quantity and quality to that of the depot troops. Depot troops, the non-combat soldiers garrisoned at home, received the standard, robust American military ration. For a nation like the United States, its industrial and agricultural heartland untouched by a single bomb, this was an achievable standard. For every other major combatant, it was a fantasy. A German Lanzer like Klaus Richter, defending the Reich in late 1944, existed on a diet engineered for bare survival. His daily ration, when it arrived, might consist of 700 grams of coarse, dense Kommissbrot, a small portion of sausage or canned meat, a sliver of margarine, and a packet of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns and barley. Fresh vegetables were a memory. Fresh fruit, a myth. The entire caloric intake hovered around 2,000 calories on a good day, often far less. It was a diet of slow starvation, designed to fuel a man just enough to fight and die. The American logistical chain, by contrast, was a marvel of the modern world. While German quartermasters struggled to move meager supplies over bombed-out railways, the American Quartermaster Corps commanded a global network of ships, trains, and trucks. This colossus of supply, which armed and fueled the Allied invasion of Europe, was also tasked with feeding its captured enemies. The food destined for the POW camps in the continental United States came from the same overflowing breadbasket that fed the American military and its allies. Canned goods from California, beef from the plains of Texas, flour from the Midwest. A torrent of agricultural surplus was diverted to the more than 500 prisoner-of-war camps springing up across 46 states. The American authorities were not setting out to be benevolent hosts. They were following a rulebook their nation, alone among the combatants, had the staggering resources to fully obey. The stage was set for a collision of realities, where the grim truths of a collapsing empire would meet the astonishing abundance of a superpower coming into its own. For Klaus Richter, the journey from capture to captivity was a descent into a surreal new reality. The moment of surrender had been a blur of noise and terror. One moment he was huddled in a foxhole, the world exploding around him from American artillery. The next he was stumbling out, hands raised high, into the impassive gaze of a mud-splattered GI. The fear was absolute. He had seen what his own army had done on the Eastern Front. He had heard the whispers, the horrific tales of partisans and commissars. He expected a bullet in the back of the head. Instead, he got a cigarette and a brusque order to march to the rear. This was the first crack in the foundation of his indoctrinated worldview. The journey continued in a crowded truck. Then a temporary enclosure in France, a vast, muddy field of misery known as a Rheinwiesenlager. Here, for a brief time, his expectations of starvation seemed to be met. The rations were meager, the conditions abysmal. But this was merely a way station. The true dislocation began aboard the transport ship. Herded into the cavernous hold of a Liberty ship with thousands of other men, he endured the nauseating roll of the Atlantic. They were not treated cruelly, but as cargo. The voyage was a rite of passage, stripping them of their continent, their cause, and their identity. When they finally disembarked in Virginia, the sheer sensory overload was staggering. The docks were a whirlwind of organized chaos, with giant cranes moving with a speed and purpose he had never witnessed. The vehicles were not the coughing, smoke-belching wood gas burners of home, but a gleaming, endless river of powerful trucks and automobiles. The final leg of the journey was by train. As the locomotive steamed south, Klaus and his comrades stared through the barred windows at the American landscape. It was this vision, more than anything, that began to unravel their certainty. They passed through small towns with neat houses and manicured lawns. They saw civilians whose clothes were not patched or threadbare. They saw children who were not thin and pale. Most shockingly, they saw no ruins, no bombed-out factories, no skeletal remains of apartment blocks, no rubble-strewn streets. This land was utterly, completely untouched by the war that had consumed his entire world. His mind struggled to reconcile the images outside the window with the Germany he had left behind, a nation of hollow-eyed women picking through debris and cities erased from the map. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a decadent, racially mixed, and spiritually weak society, destined to collapse under the will of the master race. But the evidence scrolling past his window told a different story. It spoke of a terrifying, unimaginable power, a power that could wage a total war across 2 oceans and still look like this. The fear of what awaited him at the camp remained, but it was now laced with a new, unsettling feeling, a profound and deeply personal sense of awe. He was a product of a nation that had gambled everything and lost, being transported deep into the heart of a victor whose strength he was only beginning to comprehend. On the other side of the barbed wire, the American perspective was one of pragmatism and duty, tinged with a weary curiosity. For Sergeant Miller, the non-commissioned officer in charge of processing the new arrivals at Camp Clinton, this was the 3rd transport he had handled this month. A man in his late 30s from Ohio, a pre-war back injury had kept him from the fighting overseas, a fact that was a source of quiet shame. His war was here, managing the captured remnants of the enemy's armies. He did not see the arrogant supermen of the propaganda posters. He saw what Klaus saw: exhausted, frightened men, many of them teenagers, covered in sores and filth. He saw the physical effects of long-term malnutrition, the sunken cheeks, the dull eyes, the pallor beneath the grime. His primary job was to enforce the rules laid down by the Provost Marshal General's office. These rules were precise and voluminous. They covered everything from the number of letters a prisoner could write per month to the specific caloric content of their daily meals. The camp's mess officer, a lieutenant from the Quartermaster Corps, operated not on emotion but on charts and supply manifests. His orders were to prepare meals for the prisoners based on the U.S. Army garrison ration, with certain non-essential luxuries like candy and ice cream omitted. The menu was designed to provide roughly 3,400 calories per day, the amount deemed necessary for a soldier engaged in moderate labor. The fact that this was nearly double what a German soldier was receiving at the front, and significantly more than what a German civilian was getting at home, was a statistical curiosity, not a guiding principle of his work. The guards under Miller's command were a mix of men like himself, unfit for combat duty, and young recruits waiting for deployment. Their attitude towards the prisoners was a cocktail of contempt, pity, and professional detachment. They called them Krauts or Jerrys, but they rarely engaged in overt cruelty. It was forbidden, and besides, there was little point. These prisoners were beaten, defeated men. The real enemy was thousands of miles away. The American strategy, whether consciously articulated at the level of a camp guard or not, was one of overwhelming competence. The message was to be conveyed not through lectures or pamphlets, but through the undeniable facts of life inside the wire. The clean barracks, the hot showers, the medical care, and most importantly, the food. The Americans understood, perhaps instinctively, that ideology is difficult to maintain on an empty stomach. They were about to wage a psychological war where the primary weapon was not a bullet, but a slice of fresh white bread. They expected the prisoners to be sullen, perhaps defiant. They did not fully anticipate the profound, soul-shaking shock that their simple adherence to their own regulations was about to unleash. The line shuffled forward into the mess hall. The building was long and cavernous, filled with the echoing clatter of metal on metal. The air hummed with the quiet, nervous energy of hundreds of hungry men. Klaus Richter held a partitioned steel tray, its cold weight unfamiliar in his hands. He kept his eyes down, avoiding the gaze of the American sergeants who watched over the proceedings with folded arms. His heart hammered against his ribs. He moved along the serving line, which was staffed not by Americans, but by other German prisoners. These men, who had been in the camp for weeks or months, moved with a languid confidence. Their faces were fuller, their skin healthier. They looked like ghosts from a past life. The first server, a man with the insignia of the Luftwaffe tattooed on his forearm, stood before a massive, steaming vat. He plunged a heavy ladle into its depths and brought it up, dripping with a thick, fragrant stew. He dumped the contents into the largest partition of Klaus's tray. Klaus stared. Chunks of beef, cubes of potato, carrots, and onions swam in a rich, dark gravy. He had not seen a stew this substantial in 3 years. It was the kind of meal his mother would make for a holiday feast before the war. He shuffled to the next station. A prisoner with a baker's cap piled 2 thick, immaculately white slices of bread onto his tray. Not the dense gray Kommissbrot that tasted of sawdust, but soft, fluffy bread that smelled of yeast. Next to it, he placed a perfect yellow square of what looked like butter. Real butter. The next station offered a mountain of mashed potatoes, onto which another server slopped a ladleful of gravy. Then came a scoop of green beans, vibrant and glistening. And finally, at the end of the line, a man placed 2 canned peach halves swimming in syrup into a small compartment on the tray. To wash it all down, he was handed a thick ceramic mug filled to the brim with steaming dark liquid. It was coffee. He could smell the rich, authentic aroma of actual coffee beans, not the bitter tang of roasted acorns. The server pointed to 2 large bowls on a nearby table. One was filled with white crystals of sugar, the other with pitchers of fresh milk. Klaus walked as if in a trance to one of the long wooden tables. He sat down, his movements stiff and robotic. He looked at the tray. It was a landscape of impossibility. The sheer volume of food was staggering. The quality was beyond comprehension. This was not a prisoner's meal. This was a banquet. He looked around at the other new arrivals. They all wore the same expression of stunned, silent disbelief. Some men stared at their trays as if they were holy relics. An older man, a Volkssturm draftee with white hair, quietly began to cry, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. Klaus picked up the fork. His hand trembled. He took a piece of bread and dipped it into the gravy. He brought it to his lips. The taste was an explosion. It was a flavor of a world he thought had vanished forever. The war, the hunger, the fear. For a single, perfect moment, it all dissolved in the simple, overwhelming reality of a full meal. The shock of that first meal was not a fleeting sensation. It was a seismic event that shattered the foundations of Klaus Richter's reality. The act of eating was followed by a profound, disorienting wave of confusion and shame. For years he had been fed a consistent diet of propaganda alongside his meager rations. He had been told that Germany was fighting against a world of inferiors, of decadent capitalists and brutish communists whose systems were weak and crumbling. He was told that the German soldier's strength came from his ideological purity and his ability to endure hardship. That tray of food systematically dismantled every one of those lies. The unexpected outcome was not merely that the prisoners were well fed. The outcome was the complete psychological disarmament of an enemy soldier through an act of mundane logistical fulfillment. The Americans did not need to lecture him on the virtues of democracy. They did not need to show him films of their factory output. They simply had to feed him. That single meal was more effective propaganda than anything Dr. Goebbels could have ever conceived, because it was true. It communicated a number of terrifying, undeniable facts. First, it demonstrated the scale of America's resources. A nation that could afford to feed its millions of prisoners this lavishly, while simultaneously waging a global war, was a nation of unimaginable wealth and power. The stories of American weakness were not just wrong, they were absurd. Germany had never stood a chance. Second, it exposed the lies of his own leadership. If the Americans were the cruel monsters he had been told they would not be wasting such bounty on their captives. The fact that they were adhering to a code of conduct, the Geneva Convention, while his own government had systematically violated it, spoke to a moral discrepancy he could no longer ignore. In the following days, as the shock wore off and the new routine set in, the conversations in the barracks began to change. The initial disbelief morphed into a cynical dark humor, and then into a quiet, simmering anger directed not at their captors, but at the leaders who had sent them to die for a lie. Men would compare their camp rations to the last packages they had received from home, where their own families were starving. They would talk about the pristine American landscape they had witnessed from the train. The rigid discipline of the Wehrmacht began to dissolve. The die-hard Nazis became isolated figures of ridicule, their fervent pronouncements sounding hollow and foolish in a place where the evidence of their failure was served 3 times a day. The most potent weapon in the American arsenal, it turned out, was not the Sherman tank or the B-17 bomber. It was the caloric surplus. It was the can of peaches, the slice of white bread, the ladle of beef stew. For Klaus Richter and hundreds of thousands like him, the war did not end with the signing of a surrender. It ended in a mess hall in Mississippi with the shocking, undeniable, and deeply personal realization that everything he had fought and suffered for was a catastrophic fraud. The sustained period of adequate nutrition had a profound psychological effect that went far beyond mere morale. It fundamentally rewired the prisoners' perception of themselves and their captors. For men who had spent years in a state of heightened stress and deprivation, the sudden removal of the constant, gnawing anxiety of hunger created a vacuum. Into this vacuum flooded a torrent of repressed emotions, grief, disillusionment, and a deep, soul-wearying exhaustion. The initial phase was one of physical recovery. Men who had arrived as skeletal figures began to put on weight. The sallow gray complexion of malnutrition was replaced by a healthier color. Wounds began to heal faster. The lethargy and apathy that had characterized them at the front were replaced by a new energy. This physical transformation was a visible, daily reminder of the gulf between the system they had fought for and the one that now held them captive. This led to a re-evaluation of the enemy. The American guards were no longer seen as monstrous abstractions, but as individual men. Some were friendly, some were aloof, but almost all were professional. They represented a system that was not just powerful, but also ordered and predictable. In the chaos of the collapsing Reich, orders had become contradictory and suicidal. In the American POW camp, the rules were clear, and the consequences for breaking them were consistent. For many German soldiers, who had been raised in a culture that prized order, this predictability was strangely comforting. A hierarchy also developed within the camps. Die-hard fanatics and members of the SS were often ostracized by the regular Wehrmacht soldiers, who blamed them for prolonging the war and for the atrocities that had shamed the German name. The abundance of food and the lack of existential threat gave men the mental space to reflect on the nature of the regime they had served. Debates and arguments broke out in the barracks, discussions that would have been punishable by death just months before. It was the beginning of a slow, painful process of denazification, driven not by Allied re-education programs, which would come later, but by the prisoners' own reckoning with their recent past. The psychological impact was a quiet, creeping surrender of the soul. It was the realization that the American softness that Nazi propaganda had so often derided was, in fact, a symptom of an unassailable strength. It was the strength of a nation that did not need to be cruel to its prisoners, because it had no doubt whatsoever in its ultimate victory. This quiet confidence was more demoralizing than any overt display of power. It left the prisoners feeling not just defeated, but irrelevant, a sentiment that crushed the last vestiges of their martial pride. They had been transformed from soldiers of a supposed master race into the well-fed wards of a system whose power they could no longer deny. In the grand chronicle of the Second World War, the story of the German POWs in America is often a footnote. Yet the experience of the more than 425,000 enemy prisoners held on U.S. soil had consequences that rippled through the decades that followed. The well-fed, healthy prisoners became a vital source of labor, working on farms and in factories across the nation, replacing the American men who were fighting overseas. They picked cotton in Mississippi, harvested sugar beets in Colorado, and worked in canneries in Wisconsin, contributing millions of man-hours to the very war economy that had defeated them. When the war ended, the process of repatriation began. For men like Klaus Richter, returning to Germany in 1946 or 1947 was another profound shock. They left a nation of vibrant plenty and arrived in a homeland of ruins and mass starvation. The hunger winter of 1946-47 was a brutal reality, and the stories these former prisoners told were often met with disbelief and resentment by a populace struggling to survive. They were the men who had had it good in the war, yet their experience planted a crucial seed in the soil of post-war Germany. These hundreds of thousands of men had seen, with their own eyes, the reality of American industrial might and societal stability. They had experienced a system that, while holding them captive, had treated them according to a code of law and provided for their basic needs with an ease that bordered on the magical. As Germany was rebuilt and split by the Iron Curtain, these former POWs became an influential, if silent, cohort within West German society. They had no illusions about the power of the United States. When the choice was presented between alignment with the West or the Soviet Union, for many the memory of that American mess hall stood in stark contrast to the horrific stories emerging from Soviet gulags. The experience inadvertently helped lay the psychological groundwork for West Germany's firm integration into the Western Alliance and NATO. The Marshall Plan was not just an abstract economic policy. For these men, it was the logical continuation of the unbelievable abundance they had already witnessed firsthand. The story of the German POWs and their astonishment at American food is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a powerful lesson in the nature of modern warfare, where logistics are as decisive as tactics, and psychology is as important as firepower. It reveals that the foundations of a nation's power lie not just in its armies, but in its fields, its factories, and its ability to project its surplus as an instrument of influence. For a young German soldier named Klaus Richter, the war was lost not in the snows of the Ardennes, but at a simple wooden table in Mississippi, where he was defeated not by a weapon, but by an act of incomprehensible, world-altering generosity.